Japan is changing its foreign policy strategy. It's unveiled plans for its biggest military buildup since World War II.
So they made this huge decision to toss off 6 decades of relative pacifism, increase their defense budget by double.
Japan's western flank now, Japan sees risk and threat.
And for the first time, the exercise called Iron Fist said to name China as the hypothetical enemy, though the threat is real.
Military cooperation between the two countries, top of the agenda. Of course, in the background, tensions with China, never far from the mind.
Japan and the US have teamed up against China in the most aggressive way possible.
America and Japan stand firmly together in the face of aggressive and coercive actions by the Communist Chinese.
Recently, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made a big announcement. A new war-fighting base is going to be built in Japan. And during this announcement, he dropped the coldest line ever.
Those who long for peace must prepare for war.
Now you know how serious this announcement is. The U.S. already has over 120 military bases in Japan. So what makes this new upgrade so special? And how will it help counter rising Chinese aggression? Hegseth made 3 major announcements during his tour to Japan. First, that the U.S. is recommitting to Japan. Second, the U.S. will send more troops to Japan. And third, a new warfighting command will be established in Japan. While all 3 of them are bad news for China, the third one is really pissing them off the most. According to Hegseth, this joint force headquarters will help Japan and the U.S. keep China in check and discourage it from even considering any aggressive moves in the Indo-Pacific. This is a major upgrade to the United States Forces Japan, which is the U.S. military presence responsible for Japan's defense. Traditionally, the USFJ focused on administrative and logistical roles, but now it's being transformed into a joint operational headquarters designed to improve real-time command and response capabilities. This will help strengthen coordination between Japan and the US to counter China in the Indo-Pacific. So unlike the traditional USFJ, the new base will operate as a command center that will help with real-time decision-making and combat readiness. But that's not the real pain for China. What really stings China is the power US forces could gain in Japan. In fact, Hegseth's visit pissed off China so much that just a few days after the visit, China's PLA launched massive joint drills around Taiwan without any warning. It won't be wrong to call it a preparation for war, considering the scale of this exercise. 76 aircraft, over 20 Navy and Coast Guard ships, including the mighty Shandong aircraft carrier group, surrounding Taiwan's main island. China also doesn't like people talking about Taiwan as if it's an independent country. In fact, the CCP gives money to countries that toe the CCP line regarding the Taiwan issue, and it punishes countries that recognize Taiwan as a sovereign nation. The CCP's 50-cent army even dislikes videos that talk about Taiwan in a positive manner. That's why you guys can help us by doing us a big favor and hitting the like and subscribe button down below. It helps out the video tremendously against these Chinese bots. Thanks a lot. But why was China so frustrated? You see, Japan has more than 55,000 US troops stationed across Japan, who are scattered over 120 military bases. By the way, Japan hosts the largest American military presence outside of the US. And all of these come under one unit, which we already saw, the USFJ. Until now, they were only training Japanese forces. They were not meant to launch attacks. But now, things might change soon. As part of this change, the US is setting up a new War Room Command in Tokyo. This move gives more operational control and is expected to give the US commander in Japan the authority to launch combat missions from Japanese bases with the help of the Japanese military. This upgraded command will be based at Yokota Air Base in Fusa, Tokyo. Instead of building something entirely new, the US is reorganizing and enhancing what already exists. But once, a wise man said, there are no permanent friends or enemies in geopolitics, only permanent interests. So what the US is doing in Japan is not a free service. In fact, Trump even gave the biggest shocker to Japan when he said this.
And I love Japan. We have a great relationship with Japan, but we have to protect Japan. But under no circumstances do they have to protect us. I actually ask, who makes these deals?
Trump says he loves Japan, but he is also dissatisfied with the US protecting Japan. In short, Trump loves Japan, but as a friend. If you know, you know. So why did he say this? And what was he mentioning exactly? Trump was referring to the 1960 US-Japan Security Treaty, under which the US is obligated to defend Japan. But Japan doesn't offer the same security guarantees in return. So this was a fact, but not entirely accurate. You see, Japan pays an average of 211 billion yen, or around $1.8 billion each year, for U.S. forces stationed in the country. But this money isn't the reason why the U.S. is protecting Japan. The actual reason is much better than you think. The reason why Trump cannot end this deal. It turns out that it was just his normal mood swings and he isn't actually ending this deal. The reality is, the U.S. is focusing on making Japan stronger. Again, the reason isn't friendship, but geopolitics. The answer lies in Japan's growing importance as a strategic ally in the Indo-Pacific region. This move would sharpen coordination between the U.S. and Japanese forces, especially in scenarios involving rising tensions with China, including the possibility of a conflict over Taiwan. Yes, Taiwan. Because Japan would play a key role if China and the US go head-to-head for Taiwan. Now you might ask, if this is mostly China's, the US's, and Taiwan's issue, then how come it's a major challenge for Japan? The answer lies in the location of Japanese islands. If we see the map of Japan, we generally know just the mainland of Japan, but in reality it has multiple islands that are very close to Taiwan and China. In fact, some islands are so close to Taiwan that the Yonaguni Island is just 110 kilometers, or 68 miles away from Taiwan, and this makes it the nearest Japanese island to Taiwan. Although this island is not militarized yet, Japan is planning to build a military base on Yonaguni and extend the airport and port, considering the potential threat from China in case it attacks Taiwan. But the main island that poses a real threat to China is the Okinawa Island. This is because Okinawa alone hosts 32 US military bases, which includes 30,000 active troops of the US. In fact, Okinawa makes up just 1% of Japanese landmass, but hosts 70% of all US military bases in the country. But the thing that intimidates China the most is the fact that this island is just 509 kilometers, or 316 miles, from mainland Taiwan. So in case of a conflict between the US and China on the Taiwan issue, these islands are bound to get dragged into the conflict, and even the civilians would suffer. Now, Japan, being one of NATO's partners in the Indo-Pacific region, would definitely back the US in case of a conflict. So China would definitely try to prevent a US counterattack from its Japanese bases. So, to avoid getting dragged into a Taiwan conflict and deter any Chinese aggression, Japan must strengthen its military capabilities. But it turns out, the real reason behind Japan strengthening its military isn't just these islands. It's also about Japan's survival and existence. If China attacks Taiwan and threatens nearby Japanese islands, they're worried that this will disrupt the supply of advanced semiconductors and block sea lanes that supply oil to Japan. This is because almost 95% of the oil imported by Japan comes from the Middle East. On top of that, Japan is the world's largest importer of liquefied natural gas. Another reason a conflict could be a disaster for Japan is that either it would put their key maritime shipping lane into the line of fire, or Japan would block them. In fact, it's not even just about energy. Japan is highly dependent on the import of natural resources as well. For example, Japan is the largest net buyer of food products in the world. So in short, China's growing ambitions in the South China Sea and even the East China Sea pose a serious threat to Japan. But Japan is also a victim of China's hunger to grab territories, one of the major reasons behind their deep-rooted hostility. They have an ongoing conflict for the disputed islands called Senkaku Islands. These islands are currently a part of Japan, but China claims it as their territory. And China is in no mood to back off from these claims. This can be proven by the fact that Chinese government ships keep entering Japanese territorial water near disputed islands. In fact, according to a Japanese broadcaster, NHK, China has made 23 incursions in 2023 alone. China's been flexing its muscles like this to scare off anyone who dares to stand in its way. But the long-term picture of this reality is going to change soon, and the US will be at the forefront of this change. The cooperation doesn't stop at command structures. The US and Japan are also deepening their military partnership through joint weapons development. They're accelerating the co-production of advanced missile systems, including the AIM-120 AMRAAM and potentially the Standard Missile 6 or SM-6. These efforts are part of a broader strategy under the Defense Industrial Cooperation Acquisition and Sustainment or DICAS framework. The idea is to boost Japan's domestic defense manufacturing while enhancing regional security. Producing missiles like the AMRAAM will strengthen Japan's air defense and interception systems. The SM-6 collaboration will enhance the country's ability to counter incoming missile threats. At the same time, increasing local production reduces dependence on foreign suppliers and strengthens military supply chains, all while reinforcing the US-Japan alliance. But this isn't the first time the two nations have worked together on defense systems. They previously co-developed the SM-3 interceptor missile. Defense analysts believe this deeper cooperation not only strengthens Japan's capabilities, but also serves as a firm message to regional rivals. Both countries have made it clear they are committed to deterring any aggressive actions, especially from China. Several key elements define this joint deterrence strategy. First, there's the increased military presence along the First Island chain, where Japan's role in regional security is expanding. Second, joint training and military exercises between the US and Japan have intensified. And third, both countries are actively sending a strategic message to China that they are united in their commitment to stability. Japan has significantly increased its military spending. Recently, US President Donald Trump, while reaffirming the strong military partnership between the United States and Japan, revealed that Japan has committed to doubling its defense spending by 2027. He also pointed out that the US recently approved nearly $1 billion in foreign military sales to Tokyo. But is Japan serious about the security of itself in the region? Because Japan has been a pacifist nation for a really long time. Turns out numbers are not lying about Japan's commitment. On December 27, 2024, Japan's cabinet dropped a bombshell. Not literally, but financially. They approved a record-breaking 8.7 trillion yen defense budget for 2025, about $55.1 billion US dollars. That's a 9.4% jump from the previous year, and it marks the 13th straight year on defense budget growth. But that number, it's not just about money, it's about intention. Japan is no longer just talking about defense, it's arming up for deterrence. The sleeping giant is finally waking up, but the dragon is already miles ahead. And like it or not, if a war broke out between China and Japan today, China could easily crush Japan, unless the US steps in, of course. According to a US analyst, Tokyo's military posture is still evolving, not quite at the level needed to handle rising regional threats. When you compare their militaries, the gap is obvious. China's defense budget is over $266 billion, while Japan has $57 billion. China has over 2 million active personnel, while Japan has close to just 261,000. China has more tanks, more warships, and a massive missile arsenal. And while Japan relies on the US nuclear umbrella, China has its own nuclear weapons, estimated at over 500 warheads with a goal to triple this number to 1,500 by 2035. So in nearly every category, from firepower to manpower, China has the upper hand. But Japan has a crazy strategy to counter China. Japan is pouring money into something called the standoff weapons. We're talking 939 billion yen set aside for this. They're building Type 12 anti-ship missiles that can be launched from land and sea. They're working on hyper-velocity gliding projectiles to defend remote islands. And yes, they're even developing missiles that can be launched from submarines. You might ask, what's crazy about this? Isn't this a normal strategy? Well, Japan's plan is to hit enemy targets from far away, making it way too risky for enemies to come close in the first place. Japan is also buying the Joint Strike Missile from Norway's Kongsberg for their F-35A fighters, Tomahawk cruise missiles for destroyers, and JASSM-ER long-range missiles from the US for their F-15 jets. In January of 2025, the US gave the green light to sell Japan 16 JASSM-ERs for $39 million. That's on top of the 50 missiles approved in August of 2023. But here's the catch. The yen's falling value is messing with these deals. Japan ended up paying an extra 123.9 billion yen last year for American equipment, just because of currency fluctuations. Still, Tokyo is pushing forward. They're importing 2 MQ-9B Sea Guardian drones and 6 VBAT drones, all American-made. These will operate directly from Japanese warships. But at the same time, Japan is tightening up its missile defenses, especially in critical regions like Okinawa, where thousands of US troops are based. 533 billion yen has been allocated to beef up its integrated air and missile defense systems, radars, interceptors, and mobile surveillance units. There's so much news around the Japanese military, weapons, and upgrades. Now, I'm not sure if you've noticed this, but a few years ago, Japan was hardly in the news for these topics. Surprisingly, this was the case for a very good reason. Japan has long maintained a symbolic rule: no more than 1% of GDP for defense. That rule is now gone. In 2024, Japan spent 1.6% of its GDP on defense, and by 2027, it plans to hit 2%. That's a major shift, especially for a country that, after World War II, built its identity on being a pacifist power. But while this transformation looks bold on paper, it's not without controversy. Since the end of World War II, Japan's Article 9 constitution renounces war and bans maintaining traditional military forces. But now, with all these offensive capabilities being developed and deployed, critics argue that Japan is slowly undermining its own pacifist principles. While most would point to China as the reason behind this transformation, what they often miss are the two hidden threats that only Japan truly understands. You see, the second one is Russia. And the first one is weakest economically, militarily, almost on every front, but is still a huge threat to Japan. Japan has some bitter ongoing disputes with Russia for decades. After the end of World War II, Russia captured 4 islands of the Kuril Island chain from Japan. And these were Kunashiri, Etorofu, Shikotan, and the Habomai Islands. On the other hand, Japan claims these islands as its northern territories. Multiple attempts were made to resolve this issue, but the Kuril Islands have remained a disputed territory since no formal peace treaty has ever been signed by both Japan and Russia since the Second World War. Both of these countries have discussed this issue for decades to reach an agreement, but really to no avail. Finally, at one point, some level of success was achieved through discussions between the top two leaders of both countries. For example, the conflict eased in 2016 when the two countries agreed on joint economic activities, including tourism projects on the islands and visa-free visits for Japanese citizens. Just 2 years later, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe proposed splitting the islands and returning 2 of them to Japan. But Putin obviously rejected this proposal. But even at this point, the situation didn't get as bad as it is now. It worsened because of an event that became the talk of the town, and that is the Russian-Ukraine conflict. This is because when this conflict began in February of 2022, Japan imposed sanctions on Russia, which ended their economic cooperation around the islands. In response to these sanctions, Russia stopped peace treaty talks over the Kurils, ended an agreement that protected Japanese fishing vessels from being seized around the islands, and held a military exercise on the islands to practice defending against an invasion. These tensions reached a new level on September 3rd when Russia revoked an agreement that allowed former Japanese residents of the island to visit visa-free. At the same time, the Vostok 2022 naval exercise, which included joint operations with China, took place on the islands. Now, the reason that makes these islands even a bigger threat for Japan is that Russia has militarized these islands. In fact, Russia has increased its permanent military presence on these islands since at least 2015. Russia has built airstrips, barracks, deployed surface-to-air missile systems, and even deployed an estimated 3,500 troops. In December of 2021, Russia announced the deployment of more Bastion missiles on an island in the middle of the Kuril chain, known as the Matwa Island. And this was extremely concerning for Japan, because this island is just 450 miles away from Japan. YouTube just dropped a mind-boggling announcement. It is paying creators $64 million per day. Why? Well, because YouTube doesn't have enough creators. That is why you see videos on your homepage that have less than 1,000 views, like this one. Now, of course, that doesn't mean everyone should start a channel, but if you have ever wondered about starting a YouTube channel, or a faceless YouTube channel like this one, well, now's the perfect time. YouTube is paying creators millions every day, and it's pushing newer, smaller channels now more than ever. But I'm sure many of you have questions on how to get started and how to grow a channel. We get questions in our email all the time from some of you guys. So that's why we've decided to put all of our YouTube advice into one training bootcamp for the low price of completely free. So, if you're someone interested in starting your own YouTube channel, you can sign up for this bootcamp by clicking on the link in the description or on the screen. Sign up now because, unfortunately, unlike YouTube videos, the bootcamp is like a Zoom call, so it's limited to just 100 people. Okay, let's get back to the video. So Russia is a huge problem for Japan, right? It might seem that Russia poses a significant threat to Japan, given the fact that it has the second most powerful military in the world, the highest number of nuclear weapons, and advanced military technology that could inflict substantial damage on a country with a comparatively weaker military. But the reality is far different. Russia is already engaged in Ukraine and has spent a lot of money and resources there. So opening another front with Japan is almost next to impossible for Russia for one simple reason. Japan's GDP is $4.2 trillion, and Russia's is $2.021 trillion. So it's difficult for Russia to spend a huge chunk of money on another front. Japan's economy is almost twice the size of the economy of Russia. Now, this obviously doesn't mean that Japan should underestimate Russia. Again, not to forget the fact that Russia has very close ties with Japan's biggest threat, China. But what's that country who could be more dangerous despite being weaker than Japan? Well, despite it being weak, it's a nuclear power. And what makes it more scary is not its nukes, but the person handling those nukes. Okay, you might have guessed it by now. It's none other than the dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. This one incident is enough to prove how dangerous the situation is. In October of 2022, North Korea launched a ballistic missile that passed over Japan's Tohoku region. And according to Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Hirokazu Matsuno, this region is home to more than 8 million people. So in case the test had failed and the missile had fallen short, although missile tests are usually done without nuclear warheads, a ballistic missile crashing into a populated area could still cause massive damage due to its speed, weight, fuel, and the panic that it would create. The shocking fact is that North Korea has repeatedly tested intercontinental ballistic missiles. In fact, from just 2019 to 2023, North Korea has conducted more than 130 missile tests, and most likely it will continue this trend. The more concerning fact is that North Korea has 50 nuclear weapons as of 2024. So the North Korean dictator is not only increasing the numbers, but also improving the range of these weapons. What makes North Korea lethal is its improving ties with Russia and China. Because just a few months ago, Putin visited North Korea, and they signed a pact which said both of them would provide immediate military assistance if either faces armed aggression. And not to forget China's role, since Chinese assistance has been proving vital for North Korea and helped them in their nuclear program. But what makes it shocking are some patterns. In 2019, Japan reported that Pyongyang had tested 10 new projectiles, some resembling Russia's advanced Iskander missiles. These missiles have a range of 200 to 600 kilometers. That's enough to hit almost any major Japanese city. And these two countries even have unresolved issues, such as the abduction of Japanese citizens by North Korea and the status of the Korean Peninsula. From about 1977 to 1983, North Korean military and intelligence operatives kidnapped at least 17 Japanese citizens from Japan. These tensions still exist. Also in November of 2023, North Korea launched its very first spy satellite, a silent eye in the sky, capable of gathering intelligence over Japan and improving Pyongyang's targeting systems and surveillance capabilities. These threats from all three countries are becoming worrisome day by day. And this is not me saying it. Japan itself has openly admitted this. In July of 2024, Japan's defense ministry released a white paper that called China and Russia's joint military drills a grave concern. It said North Korea's threat is more imminent now than ever before. While China continues its gray zone tactics, that is, pushing others around without actually starting a war, it's been slowly increasing pressure, hoping to wear down Taiwan's resolve. But for Japan, whose islands sit just nearby, the danger is creeping ever closer. And it's not just military muscle. Economic pressure is another card that China plays. With deep trade ties, any tensions between the two nations can ripple across supply chains, affecting everything from electronics to energy. Meanwhile, Russia isn't staying silent either. When reports surfaced in November of 2024 that the US might deploy missiles in Japan as part of a joint Taiwan defense plan, Russia warned of a retaliation. The Kremlin sees any American presence in Japan as a threat to its own security. And let's not forget what North Korea once said in 2017. They threatened to sink Japan, calling the United Nations a tool of evil and demanding it be dismantled. Pyongyang even slammed a US-Japan missile co-production deal as a serious regional risk. And as if the enemies weren't bad enough, some people in Japan itself are now criticizing the country's move to rearm. Not too long ago, many Japanese were willing to die for their emperor and country. But things have changed. Now, most people aren't interested in rearming. Even the old ultra-nationalists have cooled off. Instead of pushing for a stronger military, some have actually joined groups opposing it. The passion for war and glory, it's gone. Especially among students, intellectuals, and educators, many of whom now lean towards anti-war, anti-America views influenced by communist ideology. In fact, after World War II, Japan's constitution banned rearmament, and most political parties avoided openly supporting armament due to strong public opposition. In the 1950s, Prime Minister Yoshida's Liberal Party faced pressure from the US to strengthen Japan's military. To push forward, Yoshida had to form alliances with other parties like the Progressives and a breakaway liberal faction led by Hatoyama. However, opposition from left socialists and farmer parties, many with communist sympathies, made rearmament politically difficult. Any serious rearmament plan required a slow and complex constitutional amendment process. But Japan has been finally defying all these problems and rearming itself with some of the most advanced weapons on the planet. It's buying F-35B stealth fighter jets from the US, aircraft capable of short takeoffs and vertical landings. It's even converting 2 of its helicopter carriers to deploy these fighters. Japan currently has no F-35Bs, but it plans to acquire 42 of them in total, starting with 8 in 2025 and expanding to 30 by 2029. The F-35B's stealth features, including radar-absorbing materials and an internal weapons bay, provide a decisive edge in evading enemy detection. It's also building up missile defenses, launching a space security unit, and preparing for cyber and electromagnetic attacks. The Japanese Defense Ministry wants to build 2 warships, which will have the radar capability to intercept North Korean missile launches. To counter China, as we saw, it plans to acquire 500 long-range US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are capable of striking deep inside of Chinese territory. It also has focused on improving amphibious warfare, which is basically its ability to quickly move its troops from the ocean onto the beach. On top of that, it is also focusing on building a chain of new military bases along the southern islands with the US's support. Japan's plan is simple. By fiscal year 2027, Japan aims to enhance its defense capabilities so that it can handle invasions on its own, and effectively counter such threats with support from its allies. In about 10 years, it plans to further improve its defenses to detect and defeat invasions even earlier, and from an even greater distance. Now, it's only a matter of when we will witness Japan becoming a military superpower. Thanks for watching.